going to be picking up where we left off after the last video where we're going over some of the assignment details and looking at some of the examples and things for the digital essay, and talked about some of the things that we're going to be working on. Those things, by the way, are also on your assignment sheet, because you do have, just like with the annotated bibliography, a grading rubric that lists like the skills we're going to be working on. So what I'll be looking for to see if you've worked on in your essay. I also said right now we're just kind of working in your notebook and on a Google Doc. We will kind of transition things onto a Wix, but you know, one step at a time. So for this one, we're going to kind of set the stage a little bit for kind of what academic argument is and what we're going to be working on, and then do a little bit of brainstorming to get you ready for the second part of the week, and also some of the things we're going to be working on next week. So we're going to start with academic argument intro. So a couple of things that I want you to kind of write down and remember, because it does sort of set up like what the expectation are, not for the digital component of the digital essay, but the academic component of the essay. So first thing you want to remember is it's for scholars by scholars. So any sort of writing that you do, like once you're kind of in college, no matter what level you're at, you're within an academic community. And so the assumption is that once you're part of this community in this group, there's sort of an assumption that you either are, that you're fluid with and have respect for the values and conventions of the academic genres that exist and that you will be working with. And for the academic context that you'll be working in, or that you're at least practicing it. So I know at this point it's more that you're practicing it, but you're working toward mastery. So opinions are situated in conversation. So again, they're situated in, we did that round table, and you've been kind of working on your own like visual of the conversation that you've been researching. So your opinion is situated in that conversation, in your understanding of what's happening in the conversation, in the texts and perspectives that exist, not in a vacuum, not like, this is what I think because this is what I think, and this happened to me once. It's not. So it's situated in the whole picture, and in your understanding of the issue. And your whatever opinions and claims and analysis that you offer. So basically any author commentary is logical and grounded in evidence, and we'll talk more about that in this unit. That your compositions make a contribution. You might occasionally be asked to write something that's more report-like, especially for a test where you're just sort of maybe sometimes reporting on what you learned. But even genres like lab reports, I've heard, I don't use lab reports, but I have heard faculty that do talk about how like it's really difficult to get students sometimes to understand how to argue in a lab report. And those are very objective. It doesn't seem like you would be arguing, but anytime you're drawing analysis, so like those like scholarly articles, they're not biased. They're very credible and very fair, but they also have a discussion and a results section. And what are they doing? They're interpreting and commenting on the data. It's an argument. Might not be a popular argument the way that we think about it, but it is a type of argument. It's persuasive because it offers analysis and interpretation of data, of evidence. So you want to make sure that you're saying something to push the conversation forward, not just reporting and almost like patchworking. Sometimes if you're reporting, sometimes it kind of looks a little bit like patchworking, like you're just copying and pasting or getting from all these places and just saying, here's what all of these people said, done, without adding something from you. So you don't want to simply report on what's been said. Academic arguments are fair. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but it's possible to write an argument that is logical, engaging, and not grounded in bias. Bias comes from not from having opinions, but not offering opinions, but from offering opinions, that are overly emotional, that aren't based on your knowledge, the conversation, that aren't paired with credible evidence, that aren't considerate of other perspectives. So a lot of times when we think of bias, bias is something that is invested in this being the answer, so they won't consider other things. They might leave out information, so it leaves out, it will omit it, which is leaving out, sorry. It will sometimes manipulate or tweak, like anything that kind of pulls the reader toward this direction using something other than evidence. So it's one of the reasons, we stay away from those articles that it's just the writer talking and there's nothing included, because that's completely biased. They have nothing. So just to keep in mind that we're working on having a fair argument, an argument that is to be heard, not to win no matter what. We're talking about academic writing and persuasion. I want to kind of differentiate between a popular argument and an academic argument. So popular arguments, we can see them in lots of places. Most arguments are popular arguments, not academic arguments. So commercials, social media threads, you know what I'm talking about, especially lately. All of the political arguments and back and forth that typically are based on all different kinds of evidence, depending on whether people are checking what they're reading or not. Personal arguments that you have with people, a lot of online articles and stuff, blogs often, because they're from just that person's perspective, their life. They're not based on evidence or anything. News, a good bit of news, and politics, pretty much all politics. Are popular arguments that can be a little bit biased, because the goal is to argue to win. Whereas if an academic argument, the goal is, again, to be heard and understood, to contribute something, to say, well, here's how I see it. Not necessarily to manipulate or twist or get the other person to agree with you, but if they can understand where you're coming from, that's a step forward. That's adding something to the conversation. This will kind of get into a little bit more because we're going to do appeals, but kind of thinking about the fact that popular arguments often do not really focus on logic, and a lot of times over rely on emotion, whereas with logical arguments, part of creating that academic argument is that you have a well-rounded use of the three appeals. You're building credibility, you are making logical claims, you're using evidence, and you're using emotion for appropriate purposes and not in unfair ways. Oh, sorry, it's doing that thing again. So one of the main things, I guess, to take away with this is that a lot of these popular arguments can be unfair and manipulative, especially regarding other perspectives, and sometimes omit information. They sometimes omit or unfairly represent other perspectives, and omit information that makes them look wrong or dismiss it altogether. Don't give it fair consideration. Whereas in this context, we're going to be striving for credibility and fair-mindedness, so representing opposing views and representing them fairly, and striving to address, understand, and refute opposing information and perspective. So getting at everything and not leaving something out because it's inconvenient to what we have to say. We're also going to be kind of figuring out how and when it's appropriate to use subjectivity and objectivity and be, or what things we consider to be subjective versus objective. We tend to say subjectivity, we tend to associate it with bias, and I guess it can be because it's more about your personal opinions and beliefs and values and things like that. And objectivity is supposedly based completely on data, but sometimes it's really they kind of bleed into each other a little bit. And I'm not saying that I'm encouraging being completely subjective, but there are times when talking about personal things, when using personal experience, and having that emotion and that discussion of how you see the world. There are times when that's appropriate, and to balance that with your objective analysis of data. So they both can work, and kind of like emotion, we tend to demonize the personal stuff, but in some genres, like in the essay we're about to write, it can be appropriate and it can be encouraged. Again, it's according to the genre that you're working in, the field that you're working in. But if you, I mean, if you have an issue that is strictly scientific, you might not have a lot of the subjective material. However, if you have something that's more based on a popular or political or social justice issue, you may have some of those things and be trying to balance those experiences also with your data and your research that you're finding. So the trick is, again, to be able to balance and like know when it's appropriate. So a couple of things, tips for kind of doing this. Avoid overly emotional language. A lot of it is in the trick of the wording. It's not just sharing experience, it's sharing experience in ways that basically like just drip with bias. When you're talking about these other people, but it's with insults or extreme language. And I don't mean like cuss words. I mean like you're clearly angry, like the readers can feel your emotion. So avoiding overly emotional language, avoiding absolute statements like this group always does this, or this is how it always happens, or this will definitely, like if we make this decision, this will definitely happen. Because most things exist in a gray area. So again, it makes you as the writer appear less fair-minded when you're speaking in absolutes and when you're speaking overly emotionally. So it's about kind of keeping control of yourself also, especially if you're emotionally invested in something. Addressing other perspectives and describing them fairly. We'll talk about that. Basically kind of thinking about like when you're describing a different perspective, not using that opportunity to make them sound stupid or make them sound wrong, but so that they would read it and kind of their response would be, okay, yeah, that's how I feel. And giving them credit if they have good ideas or similar concerns, or if anything that you share, like being willing to like address that. Consider where the other side, again, getting into that now, where other side makes good points. So noting where like there's ideas or concerns or questions or evidence that's valid or understandable, and address problem areas that can even exist within your own perspective. If you can't have your perspective and the way you see it, and in order for that to work, you have to leave out things, or you have to not be able to address it. Address like problems that you see even with your own perspective. That's kind of keeping everything like very black and white. And again, that makes you seem biased. And it also discredits your argument. So we'll talk more about that. So we're going to get into your brainstorming. And again, for this brainstorming, you're welcome to do this in your notebook. We will, again, I did say you could do all of your not your brainstorming, but your drafting in a Google Doc for now for your digital essay, but we're not going to like set it up and do a formal thing, because eventually we're going to move it into the, into Wix. So it's kind of up to you whether you want to work on a single document or anything like that. There are many types of arguments. The first step to planning is figuring out what you want to say, because that's what we're going to kind of at least get started on. Identifying what type of argument it is, or at least what you're thinking about. Again, you're not married to any of these ideas. We're going to workshop these a little bit later. Figure out how you need to arrange kind of what you want to say, like the type of argument and the order that's going to be helpful. We are going to really work on this, like what you want to say and the kind of argument that it's going to be. Some people may start thinking ahead and knowing, like we always said, this essay has to have at least three body sections. So some people might be thinking, okay, I know I want to do I know I have an idea for a solution. So I know I have a solution section. So going ahead and kind of thinking about how you might, getting some first thoughts about how you might want to order things. So we're going to start by getting a sense of what you want to say. The first thing I want you to try to write down some ideas for in your notebook is, what is the actual debate? Sometimes people really run into a problem with figuring out what their thesis statement is going to be, because they are kind of misconstruing or misunderstanding what the debate is. So if something is a conversation, people are talking about something, but you have to ask yourself, what are they really talking about? Like, where is the disagreement? Are they for or against something? Are they arguing that something is real or not real? You know, you can't argue that somebody is, that, I've had people say they can't address other perspectives because they don't really have an against. Then that's probably not what the conversation is about. It might be, is this real or not? And I mean, like, an example of that would be like global warming. Like, is this really happening or not? Should or should not? Is there a problem or is there not a problem? So trying to, I guess, almost like raise awareness and convince people that, like, they're not, it's not like they don't know that this happens. They just maybe don't care about it or see it as big of an issue as it should be. Is it something we've already established is a problem and people are arguing about how we're supposed to solve it? And that's what they're talking about. Or they're arguing about what causes it. Sometimes before we can figure out how to solve the problem, even if we know it is a problem, we have to figure out what is causing it or influencing it, or is there like a correlation between these two things? For instance, I've had people write essays about and do their project on domestic violence. And you're going to have a really hard time writing an essay about domestic violence and finding people that are for it, at least that are willing to write about it and publish it on the internet where other people can see it. So, but I don't have anybody that's really against it, so I have no argument. That's not true. The debate isn't whether or not it's people should or shouldn't do it necessarily. What people are talking about is, so people kind of know it's a problem. There might be some, like, is it as big of a problem as people think it is, that kind of thing. But the main thing is this. People are arguing about what causes this, what are the influences, what are the correlations, like what's really at the root of this issue. And that's where the debate is. Or the effects. So like, what are the real effects, good, bad, ugly, gray area, of this thing or this trend that's happening. So here are 7 options. You can, branch off from here. There's probably lots of others, but these are just some ideas for how you can at least grab a couple of these and take a few minutes and write down like one or two of these that you feel like best describes like what the debate is. Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes with that and then come back to me. We'll move on to the next slide. Is getting down your first thought. So this is sort of what I would consider like a word vomit. The idea here is to just sort of type what you're thinking at the end of this research, stuff that stands out to you, stuff that I gave you some sentence starters here. If you get stuck, you don't have to do all of these. They're not required. They're just ideas if you struggle with things like this. So it was important for me to find out that, or I wish people better understood, or we could solve this problem by doing this, or I still support, or I know now the real problem is this, I agree, disagree, believe, I was surprised to learn, I want to argue, whatever. I have questions about. So the goal here is to write kind of for 5 minutes. You can just kind of set a timer or just like shoot for half a page, something like that, where there's no, you don't want to stop or erase or kind of repeat, like grab a couple of different things, write from your interpretation or your, things that you've read, stuff you remember from your research, just as much as possible, whatever you're thinking. So the goal is kind of just to get down your first thoughts. We might be able to turn that into some ideas in a minute. So go ahead and do that next. Thing is, and this should just take maybe a minute or two. This is super easy. Just kind of read over what you have, the jumbled mess. It's okay if it doesn't make sense, has grammar errors, has misspelling. But the goal is really to look through and like underline or otherwise kind of note any good points that you see. Anything that you wrote that stands out to you as being like, I definitely want to talk about this in my essay, or this might even be a good starting point for like a potential argument or a thesis statement. So anything that kind of jumps out at you there. So take a minute to do that and then we'll move on. The next thing we're going to figure out is, what kind of argument is it? Okay. I would like for you can do this after I'm done or while I'm kind of going through these. list and make notes on a few ideas for a specific message. Perhaps you don't have to like have a thesis or be able to be at the point where you want to write a thesis statement. Sometimes you even have to do some writing before you have a thesis statement at all. But here are some different types of arguments that you'll notice are pretty close to these different kinds of debates. So these might describe like what the conversation is, and some of these popular kinds of arguments sound pretty close to some of these. So you can actually kind of look through maybe what you said your debate was, what maybe some of your good ideas were, and see if they match up with any of these, and just sort of jot down what kind of argument you think you're going to be making. The first one is a claim of fact. That's like when you argue that something is either indeed true, like real or not, or is indeed or in fact a problem or not, like people should care more. Sometimes it's the like raising awareness and stuff like that. Do you want to clear up a misconception that your audience might have about an issue? Usually this is similar to some of the other arguments we have on here, but it's distinct because the entire essay is basically like refuting a perspective. You know, you might have seen like a cheesy sample or example of this, like when you're online and you see like the Mythbusters, where they'll say like, here's the myth and here's where it comes from and here's why it's wrong and here's the next one. The whole essay is about refuting myths, kind of like that. The whole essay is focused on clearing up a misconception. So maybe you want to reach a reader who you feel like really doesn't understand, has a different perspective, and you want to specifically address this perspective. You feel like it's a stereotype or it's based on incorrect information, and you really just want to say like, here's what people think to be true, here's where it comes from, here's why it's not true. Next, here's another kind of perception that this other group or this audience has. Here's how I want to clear it up. So you're really just narrowing it in on something like that. Do you want to show a correlation between two things? So usually we're looking for causes for a problem, like domestic violence, or is there a correlation between video game violence and violence in teens? Like, does one actually cause the other? Do you want to persuade an audience to change their opinion about some aspect of your issue? So a lot of times this is those like should or should not, for or against, that kind of thing. Do you want to persuade a particular audience to change their behavior or actions? So usually this is like, not just you want your audience to think this, you want them to like take an action or adopt a different behavior. Like, I want to write my essay to convince my readers or talk to my readers about why I'm a vegetarian and why they should be too. Like, you want them to do something different at the end. So these are kind of related, except one more is just about thinking and opinion, one is about taking action. Do you want to propose a policy change to solve a problem, or just solve a problem? So one, you could be criticizing a policy. Maybe you don't necessarily have a solution, but the first step is to show that there's a problem with this policy. And this is, again, like some of these are related. Like this is really related to arguing that something is a problem. Like, but trying to show that like, here's how we're currently doing it and here's how it's not working. That could be your argument in and of itself. You don't necessarily have to have a solution. Just convince people that this isn't working and why. Or maybe we already know something isn't working and you have an idea for how to solve it. So here's your ideas. Maybe write down like one or two of these that really seem to match up with kind of what you think you might want to do. The next thing is your audience. And again, I'm not saying you need to like name a group, because it's not always that simple. But a couple of things. One, your audience can't be everybody, because that's literally everybody. And anyone who has access to it isn't an audience either. You're thinking about a target. Like, yes, everyone might, like a lot of people might benefit from it. Yes, a lot of people might have access to it. But who are the people that you are really speaking to? Like, you want them to hear you, or you think they would most benefit. Not that these other people, you can't think about them, but who's your target? Who's in the bullseye? And again, it might not be about naming the group, but we went through earlier in this semester some of the characteristics of an audience that you might have to think about. If you're writing about a political issue, their political affiliation is going to matter. Possibly their age group, or their socioeconomic bracket, or their like religion or values. So kind of thinking about that, like what are the characteristics of the audience that you really kind of want to target, like a certain age group, a certain knowledge of the issue. Maybe you're talking to people who don't know that much about the issue, or you're talking to people that kind of have a good knowledge base on this issue, but they think differently about it. So how would you describe like who you want to be in the bullseye? And again, you can write lots of different things. You might not even have a solid idea yet, but just write down what you can think of now. And then consider also, like, another way to think about it is like which potential audience would, again, like, benefit the most. Who should hear your perspective? So kind of thinking about it that way, like, who do I most want to reach? Who do I most want to hear me? Or who might benefit the most? And then what are some characteristics? So that's the last thing that we're going to do. And then you're ready-ish to start writing your thought letter, which we're going to be writing in session 2. Peace.